Good morning, everybody. Hi. It's lovely to have you all here. Thank you for coming out. And my name is Mining Indaba. I'm one of the committee members for Women in Mining South Africa. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosted here by Wentzel today. Thank you very much for hosting us. And thank you to everybody for coming out today. I have been reminded by a number of people that the president is speaking at 10 o'clock and that my panel is not more important than the president, which I find very strange. But anyway, we'll let that go and we will aim to be done so that everybody can go and listen to the president do his address. Right, so we're talking about mine safety today. And as much as there's nothing new about the concept of mine safety in the mining industry, and there's widespread agreement that safety concerns all of us, and that a very robust safety culture is required, we still end up with mine safety issues. And with ESG being high on the platform and there being an overlap between mine safety and a lot of ESG issues, we thought it appropriate to talk about mine safety today and whether mine safety is influencing investor decisions in sufficiently broad dimensions. So mining is, 15,000 miners are killed every year. It's the industry that has the greatest number of safety issues in it. And this is just the number of official deaths. We're not talking about people in communities. We're not talking about undocumented deaths. We're not talking about artisanal miners. And ESG has risen in prominence over the last couple of years. It's the key theme for the Mining Indaba this year, which is wonderful to see. And that's brought about largely by the increase in intensity and frequency of intense climate events around social license to operate, around the complexity around artisanal and small scale mining issues, human rights, gender, and so on. And they all overlap with mine safety, making mine safety a much more complex issue than I think we sometimes give it credence for. So the question to the panel is whether these many dimensions and these overlaps are being adequately considered in mining decisions. And our panel today includes Kate Collier, who's a partner from Wentzel and focuses a lot of her work around safety audits and advising on mine safety issues. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
Pietro Dupasani, who is the head of business improvement at Anglo American and our chairperson of Women in Mining South Africa. Tebogo Masita, who is a top 100 inspirational woman from the 2018 group, I believe, okay, and runs her own business in the mining industry. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and I'm the director of WiMSA South Africa.
And the director of WiMSA South Africa. I'm so sorry, I forgot that. Good save. Then Lindy Scott, who is the founder of Amber and has developed some very creative and innovative ways of communicating safety in the industry. And then Estelle Levin, who is the founder and head of Levin Resources.
Levin Sources.
Sources.
Don't worry, everyone makes a mistake. I should have not chosen that name, but it's Levin Sources, not Lemon Sources.
Excellent. Now we know you are very relevant here because I don't know what we'd do with lemon sauce. And is also representing WIM UK.
Thank you.
So thank you, panelists, for being here. Let's start out with some opening comments around your involvement in mine safety and your thoughts around any kind of mine safety specific observations over the last few years in relation to COVID and in relation to some of the overlaps that we've talked about. Okay, so I'm going to start with you.
Oh, great. Thank you. So my involvement with mine safety is obviously from the legal perspective, but I think why I have such a passion for it is that as a lawyer, it allows me not only to be involved in a wide range of legal matters, from the pure commercial, litigation, investigation type matters, but it also is so important. It allows me to still have that human element because so much of safety is person driven.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes me away from my desk and allows me out into the field to actually interact with people who it affects on a day-to-day basis. My key observations from a health and safety legal perspective over the course of the last few years has been watching the change, and Garen Rapson and I were talking about it earlier, in safety moving from the G element, so a governance, a regulatory, a tick box effect, to an understanding of the importance of it in a social context. And I think COVID really drove that message in understanding the impact of what's happening in the communities and how that brings diseases into workplaces, and how the impact of how employers deal with those issues can then infiltrate and uplift communities in a direct and immediate way.
Great, thank you. Before we move to you, Petra, I'm very sorry, I've forgotten to welcome the people who are joining us online on Zoom. So welcome to you as well. Petra.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Brian said, I'm the chairperson for Women in Mining South Africa, but my real job in the real world is head of business improvement for Anglo American Platinum. And being head of business improvement, for me, safety is very close to my heart in two ways. Firstly, through improving our business and through planning our work better, it's safer. So if we all say that if you read any of the literature, it will tell you that planned work is 70% safer than any unplanned work. So in my day-to-day work, it's all about improving productivity, but also with an eye on making our environment safer for all of our employees to work there. And then secondly, for the past 2 years, I've been studying. And one of the things that I've been studying is the impact of leadership on safety and what type of leadership do we need to eliminate fatalities in the South African mining industry. But I think it's also applicable to the broader mining industry as well. And I'm sure we'll speak a little bit more about that in the follow-up questions.
Thanks, Petra. Teboko.
For me, when we talk about safety, especially as a woman in business in the mining sector, you know, I believe as women, we need to be safe and work in a safe environment. So what is more important is like the psychological safety of women in mining. And I want, you know, the mining companies to really invest in making sure that women are working in a safe environment, and as well as the community and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right, so my name is Lindy Scott, and my role in mining is really to help the safety professionals and leadership who have taken on board all these new trends and new ways of thinking in safety, but really to help them make it come to life in terms of communication. So we would often spend time on the ground working with the workers to really bring creativity in the way we speak about it, and tactics in which you can open the dialogue. So that for me has always been a huge part of the work we did in safety, but we were very much doing that one-on-one in different mines. So we actually looked at how can we scale and make what we do in creativity accessible to all mines, all workers, all communities. So we actually worked the last 2-3 years building a platform to really give to help creativity and safety comms scale. So instead of it just being one-on-one and this access to interesting content and the new way of thinking about safety, really to be accessible. So that's what we've been working on and how we serve the mining community.
Thanks, Lindy. And finally, Estelle.
Well, most of my work is actually with market players, not so much investors. It's with gold refiners, battery manufacturers and others who are downstream of mines. And we help them with their human rights and environmental due diligence. And a lot of our sourcing work has actually been to do with sourcing from artisanal and small scale mining, which I think is a little bit less relevant here directly, but it's interesting to see what the refiners prioritize. When a gold refiner is, or really any metals trader is looking to source from artisanal small scale miners, there's a minimum set of risks that they need to be doing due diligence on. And those are captured in what's called Annex 2 of the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Sourcing of Minerals from Conflict Affected and High Risk Areas, a very catchy title. And yes, sorry, I have remembered it. It took me 10 years to learn it, but I've got there eventually. Actually, the risks that are in there are the worst human rights violations and business integrity risks, but those refiners have chosen to make health and safety the other thing that they do due diligence on, because they simply could not tolerate the concept of sourcing without making that a priority. I think that's indicative of the overall importance that people see that if you're not taking care of your people, can we trust you be taking care of other broader risks? So I think reputationally and just from a broader risk management point of view, that preventing fatalities, avoiding injuries, ensuring that your workers at the very minimum are really well looked after. It says an awful lot about your culture to risk more broadly. And so it's really a metric, a proxy metric for risk management more generally.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for the introductory statements. So Kate, let's move over to you. Can you give us an overview of what investors look for when they're looking at mine safety as part of an investment decision, what guidelines and regulations they're considering, and are there any instances where safety has halted an investment decision?
So in the South African context, it varies significantly, depending really on who the parties are and, to put it frankly, how sophisticated they are in terms of their thinking and understanding of safety culture. And it varies from clients who just want to know, well, am I compliant? Are there safety issues and permitting issues that could halt the transaction? So are there change of control provisions? Are there permitting considerations that we need to think about that could stop us operating from the date of the transaction? To industry organizers or to role players who want to understand any transferring risk. And that's really where they would want to understand what has happened in the past. Have there been fatalities? Are there prosecutions that could come out of the woodwork? And then very few actually get down into understanding the safety culture. The stuff that isn't in, do we comply with the act and here are all our checklists, but understanding how employees grapple with safety every single day in the workplace. Do we understand it? And is it something that is cared about at every level of the organization, from supervisory level all the way through to board members? And it's striking how diverse the approach can be, from some who simply want to know, well, how can we price this and how can we limit our risk, either passing it on, hopefully contractually, or scoping it in to be dealt with in the future. And others who then really want time, particularly with the senior leaders and the board members, to understand the approach towards safety. There has been more of a swing, I'm glad to say, to people who want to understand that safety culture. But the majority of investigations that we do from a legal perspective still sit in that regulatory space. So what permits do I need? Are they going to transfer? And from there, it's very seldom that you'd see, game stoppers from a safety perspective, because they can be fixed. And the contractual risk can be managed. And warranties and indemnities are provided, and we can do technical audits post-closing, and we can fix issues. But more often than not, we're starting to have the conversations about, well, if we need to fix things, what kind of on-the-ground discussions need to have to fix the culture in understanding and to prevent things? Because it's one thing knowing what happened in the past and putting in place a legal strategy for if charges come or if investigations and inquiries are held. But how are we properly learning from those accidents to make sure that they're not going to be repeated? And often the real obligations from a safety perspective are the unwritten things, the obligations that have been given to regulators to invest in certain, new technology, to do additional training. So what we would look for is not necessarily how many accidents have I had, but how many stoppages have we had because of fall of ground management? How many times have particular teams not properly done safe entry examinations? Because to me, that goes more to, well, yes, it's a training issue, but it's possibly also a culture issue. And those are the things which ultimately, although we can get you through on a do I comply with the law questionnaire, will result in that investment being worthwhile, because those are things that could in time halt operations for a longer period in the event of a collapse or a fatality or a regulatory blitz, which closes the plant. And I suppose the final tag on that companies are looking at more significantly now is the reputational risk that comes with the longer term impact, particularly on the health related issues. I can look at a document now that says that there are well managed health risks, but we know that often diseases come up far later down the line. And what is the plan to manage that risk in real terms for the families and communities that are impacted?
Yeah, so that kind of range between compliance and risk prevention and management is massive.
Yeah.
And in the ESG world, kind of more than a decade ago, the Equator Principles and the IFC performance standards were developed to kind of create a level playing field for investors to also have a little bit more stick in making sure that these issues were addressed properly. Has something similar been done from a safety perspective?
So in the South African context, the focus really is still on regulatory compliance. So it's the Mine Health and Safety Act, and then of course it's any listing rules and guidelines, and depending on where the transaction is sitting. We would look at industry best practice, but more often than not, it depends on how sophisticated that organization is and what they have ascribed to. And in particular, if they're following any of the international management standards, which we're hopefully having more employers moving towards, because it allows really for a risk-based and risk response approach that's suitable for each workplace, rather than simply a tick box approach. And really trying to go beyond mere compliance to making sure that people can legitimately be safe at work.
Thank you. I'm trying to decide whether to ask Estelle a question or ask Pietro a question, but you've talked a lot about safety culture and that lends itself to leadership. So I'm going to come to Pietro. Pietro, you've spent the last 2 years doing your EMBA, and part of that was a research project on how leadership can contribute towards reducing and minimizing safety incidences. So can you maybe just chat to us a little bit around, you talk in your research around the anatomy of a safety leader. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit more about that and how that should be influencing decisions around culture and safety leadership?
Yeah, when I started my research, I had a look at the history of mine fatalities in the South African mining industry. And we've come a long way, from the 80s and the 90s to where we are right now. We had a very checkered past in terms of big mining incidents over the last 100 years. But if you look at the statistics, that's been coming down steadily since the 1980s. And this has been attributed mostly to understanding our geology better, putting better safe assessments in place. But for me, I think the biggest contributor has been the change in leadership and the change in which our executives and top leadership view safety and the importance thereof. So when I did the research, I interviewed a number of safety leaders, top executives in various mining companies to get their perspectives on what are the types of leadership qualities that we need to completely eliminate fatalities in the mining industry. So we did some very in-depth interviews, and there's a number of themes that came out as a result of that. And when I mention the themes, you'll probably think, that's just good leadership. But if you envision a mining operation, the first thing you think about is not necessarily an empathetic leader, okay? But if I just go through some of the key themes that came out of that, the very first thing for leadership in the mining industry is firstly to believe that we can actually live in a world where there are no longer mining fatalities. So it's firstly very important to believe that we can get there. If leaders don't believe that we can get there, then it will influence the way in which they make decisions. If you don't believe that we can actually get to a fatality-free mining environment, it will influence the way you budget. It will influence the way in which you employ people. So it's very important to start with believing that it's possible. But in the same time, holding two sort of opposite thoughts in your mind, you have to believe we can get there, but you also have to believe that we aren't there at the same time. So you constantly have to have this sense of unease, this restlessness, this readiness to respond at the same time. So we have to believe we can get there, but then act in a way as if a fatality can happen at any time, and be very vigilant about it. This also leads to one of the general managers that I interviewed during this process. I asked him, what is the most important thing that you believe needs to happen in your operation? And he said that you truly have to care about your employees. You truly have to care with them, connect with them, be empathetic. And the way in which he does it, he's the general manager of a refinery, is to get to know each and every person's name in the organization. Because if you know somebody's name, if you know something about them, you are going to care a little bit more about them. So it's around really making a true connection with your employees and knowing something about them. Then the fourth thing is all around conversation and being comfortable to have difficult conversations. Because it's not always easy to have a safety conversation with somebody. And it's not something that a lot of technical people are really comfortable with, because you've come up through the ranks as a technical person, and now you have to connect with people. So you have to learn and you have to be taught how to have a proper safety conversation. So conversation is really, really important. And then if you're having a conversation with somebody and they tell you something, to follow up on it. So it's really important to follow up. If people tell you something, you've asked them to give you your inputs, and then you have to treat them as if they are early warning system. If somebody tells you something is wrong, they feel uncomfortable working in a certain part of the plants, or there's a certain part of the mine that they don't want to be working in. There's a reason they don't want to go there. So listen to them and do something about it. Then there's also a whole part, there's sort of two different types of leaders that emerged as a result of the study. The first is you're a leader that you have a legal responsibility for people. And if you're that type of leader where you've got a legal appointments and you have to look after people, it's important to be in the operation, be visible, be authentic, listen to people, and actually follow up on all of the things that you hear. And then the second type of leadership is sort of a bottom-up leadership as practice. Every single person in the organization can be a safety leader. And leadership as practice is we all work together as a team, almost like playing in an orchestra. So if we're doing our work, it means that we're constantly aware of the environments around us, and anybody can speak up and they can say, I'm not feeling safe or comfortable in this situation. So that it all leads to moving away from a blame culture to a culture of psychological safety, where each and every person is listened to. So that's really important, is to create that sort of environment where each and every person feels comfortable to be able to raise any sort of issue. And then the sort of, I don't know how many I've mentioned already, but the sort of second to last one is that leadership is all around creating a culture and an environment where people are comfortable, but at the same time, making sure that the systems, the underlying safety systems, are working properly. So it's good to be an empathetic leader that's authentic and visible in your operation, but then it needs to be backed up by safety systems that are actually working. Okay. And then the very last theme that I looked at was, I was quite interested to know whether in South Africa, we're quite comfortable with risk. Okay. So I was wondering if the environment in South Africa is conducive to risk taking. Are people in South Africa used to taking risks, and then in that way they might take that into the operation. But there were some very good stories of the general managers that I spoke to, who said to me, no, because when you drive to a mining operation, sometimes you'll see that somebody is speeding to get there, and then as soon as they clock in, then all of a sudden they have to be safe. Okay. And
I've never seen that happen. I don't know what you're talking about.
And what they said to me is, we want to try and create in the mining operation a safe haven where people know once you come through the gate, that's it. Okay, there's no incidents will be tolerated, zero toleration for harm. So the whole thing is, as a safety leader, it's important to create those sort of islands of sanity inside of the madness that's the rest of South Africa in terms of potholes and speeding and all that sort of stuff, So that's another thing, is in our context, it's important to create a safe haven inside of your operation where people know this is what we do and what we don't do. So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell everything that came out of the types of leadership qualities that are important for us to move to closer and closer to zero fatalities.
Yeah, so moving completely away from compliance and more proactive, more risk management, introducing the fact that everybody is a safety leader, not just the person who holds the legal responsibility. And I want to take it a little bit further in terms of safety beyond the bounds of the operation, because so far what we're talking about is what happens in the confines of the operation. But mines are porous. They spill over into communities. You have to access a mine through communities often. And so that interface becomes a lot more complex. And as the relationship between mines and their stakeholders gets more complex and oftentimes more tenuous, safety becomes an issue. And so I want to come to you, Estelle, because this is something we talked about a little bit yesterday around these complex relationships and how once you go beyond the boundary of the mine, you're looking at kind of sustainable sourcing, you're looking at human rights issues, you're looking at gender issues, you're looking at all sorts of other things. How is safety overlapping into that realm from your perspective and your work?
Thanks, Bryony. From many ways, I think the first fundamental thing is when safety isn't being well managed. When incidents arise and there are impacts, the impacts aren't only on the individual and the mine for therefore having to mitigate and remedy that, but of course it cascades into their families and into their communities. And if you have a wife or a husband or as a parent who has been injured and they become disabled or they have a chronic illness as a result of what happened in the mine, that home is made more vulnerable and it changes lives. So the zero fatalities obligation is absolutely the only way, I think, and yet it is not something that I see with some of the mines that I've supported and worked in on their risk management. So making it done well, you have to think beyond the impacts just on the individual. You need to think about impacts on others. But the other thing that I've seen in the work that we do with large-scale mines to manage the risk of artisanal small-scale mining to them, to their people, to their asset, is sometimes the mitigation actions they put in place to lower the salience of ASM risk to them creates elevated or new hazards or elevated risk salience for the artisanal and small-scale miners. And so their safety isn't being properly taken into account when you're increasing your security presence, bringing in the mine police, building a T-wall, or doing whatever you might be doing to deal with the ASM problem. And you can therefore make those people more vulnerable. And of course, artisanal small-scale miners tend to live and work in extremely high risk situations where they don't have proper welfare care and considerations. I've seen terrible situations where there are consequences when bad security-led management of ASM really goes wrong. So those are two ways and two concerns. There is a third point, excuse me, checking my notes. The other thing that I think is interesting is actually in ASM relationships, a focus on safety can be really trust building. So a lot of large-scale mining companies are very reluctant to engage constructively and cooperate with artisanal mines, but we're seeing a sea change in that respect. And I think the new World Gold Council report on this is really instructive and very encouraging, because we're seeing many mining companies move from just, this is a problem we must eliminate by getting security to deal with it and building a big wall, to this is a community relationship issue. We need a cross-functional approach to this. And there's often a lack of trust because of the competition for the asset and the fact that, of course, artisanal small-scale miners that might be sneaking onto your concession at night are thieving your asset in your opinion, but in their opinion, they're getting access to what is the nation's sovereign wealth that they feel entitled to, but because revenues that are paid by you don't trickle back to the provinces and actually support the delivery of services to them as citizens, feel an entitlement to take. So there's different ways of seeing here at stake. When you do start to make that step into beginning to cooperate with artisanal and small-scale miners, safety is of common ground, and it's less contentious, and it's a fantastic first thing to focus on to really start that relationship off on the right footing. Even if when you look at that situation, there are other risks that might be more salient and more urgent, if you start with safety, you can lay the foundations for a much better and more constructive way of looking at it. And if I can just make one more point. We are doing a lot of work with development financial institutions and banks in Europe who, because of the various legislations coming in Europe on the corporate sustainability due diligence directive and so on, are really going to put human rights at the heart of their due diligence on investees, including in the mining and mineral sector. And they are going to be looking not just at mine safety, but of course on human rights beyond and how you remedy. And I think Pietro's point on culture, the advisory work that we do on the United Nations Guiding Principles is very much about pushing companies beyond just this compliance-led approach, like Lindy said. It's not enough to check boxes. Investors are going to be increasingly looking at, is your culture fit for purpose here? And I cannot emphasize that enough. You have to have the systems, but you really do need to have everybody living it every day. And the mining company that I've worked with, that I've seen do this, and at first, because I wasn't used to it, it shocked me, but now I love it, is Newmont, who at the start of any meeting there's a safety share. And it keeps safety first and foremost in your mind. And having come from a world of artisanal small-scale mining where safety is just not the first thing on the table when you walk into an ASM situation, and it should be, to then begin working with a large-scale mine that was in every meeting, there was a safety share, even if it was something small about wearing a seatbelt and why you would do it, really brings it to life in a day-to-day sense. And I found that very, very effective.
Yeah. So bringing that up to a materiality perspective from an investor's point, I think, is the challenge here.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about things that are material at a kind of a one-on-one level and at a household level and possibly at a community level. But it's very hard to consider those things tangibly in a investment decision. I want to come back to Kate on thoughts around kind of broadening the scope of safety considerations. Now that we've been talking a little bit more beyond kind of, we've had a fall of ground or a collapse and the impact of that.
I think it depends what the question is that investors are looking at and how the transaction is going to be structured. Because if the question is, well, am I buying into a company that complies, or am I buying into, or where's my return going to sit? Is the question, am I investing into an organization that I'm not going to get a return because operations are going to be halted, or because I'm going to be spending money fixing deviations? Is a very different approach from the outset to, am I investing into an entity that is going to drive value in people's lives? And you mentioned, a safe operation is an effective operation. It's when you start having accidents that you start spending money that you don't want to be, you'd rather see coming down to the bottom line. But I think it's how that original question is phrased, and seeing the investor value in that safe culture and in applying those principles to everyday operations in the organization, and not just how much money could I potentially lose if something goes wrong, and what is the likelihood of something going wrong in this organization. Unfortunately, in the vast majority of transactions, the question is still the former.
Yeah. And
it's what could happen that I'm not seeing that could result in unanticipated expenditure, or am I ensuring that I'm pricing this transaction correctly to take into account risks which I need to deal with in the future? I think that once the question starts changing to where should we be placing our value in seeing how we can, I suppose, attach our name to an organization that lives these values, that people can be safe at work, be safe in their communities, and not have the downstream impact of the safety concerns that you were speaking about, that will change, I suppose, the discussions all the way through to the investor decisions. And we are seeing it. And I think that it's being driven by the large corporates who really do live these, live this on an everyday basis. And Safety Shares is such a good example across a number of large mining houses who really do remind us at every instance, that this is about individuals. But I do think there's some way to go.
Yeah, ask the right question at the beginning.
Ask the right question.
Thank you. Lindy, let's move on to you, because asking the right question is also about communicating. And the work that you're doing is primarily around communicating safety in a way that's more accessible to people, that is scaled and is very creative and fundamentally kind of focused on a lot of graphics. And I would imagine, well, don't need to imagine, in the world that we live in, we have such great diversity, different languages, different cultures, different kind of expectations of safety, different kind of appetites for risk, that the work that you're doing through non-verbal communication, must be improving communication and helping people engage with safety in a different way. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that and what you're seeing coming through that work?
Perfect. Yeah, so what we do at Amber and in our practice at the Health and Safety Dialogue Company is really to bring well thought out semiotics and semantics into the communication. So you don't just stick a picture of we've all seen them, the little icon with the hard hat. A hard hat doesn't just say safe. That's not going to resonate. So what we look for is really to make ways that there's an emotional connection to the safety topic, to the lessons that you're learning. But the most important thing is you need that leadership piece first, because you can have as many cool graphics, great content, but if the leadership are not open to accepting and welcoming bad news as fast as possible, and to realize that there are these loopholes that people are taking on the ground. So we've really focused our work to be very much operational and on the ground, and to welcome the insights from the workers, but for there to be that action that you said you need to respond. So everything we've ever built, and what Amber's big methodology is that you build in the feedback loop. So you're tracking them, you're tracking your lessons, you're able to share them, so that everything is there to help people actually communicate, but keep a record, because a lot of stuff can happen just quickly in a conversation. There's body language, there's eye contact, there's people playing on their phones in conference rooms, in work as they're thinking about something at home. We're complex beings. So how do we bring it into the room and make it real? And very much in an African perspective, we've had quite a few interviews where we've spoken in the UK, and they don't often understand the community that we're working in, and why a lot of the content and the workshops and the campaigns we design has a go home element. So one of them, for example, that we do is around hand protection, and you actually sit in your workshop and hand write a letter, but it's all that subconscious behavior and learning. Like, these are the hands, I'm writing this letter to somebody I love. I'm here to, nobody comes to work and says, oh, I want to be safe today. You come to work safely. So how do these campaigns and tactics really make it real on a person level? And that leadership trust the process, trust the design thinking, trust that the information they get. We don't know what's going to come from your workers, but they are the experts. They're living these processes, these SOPs every day. So how do you make it a real conversation, but one that is easy to implement? Because if we look at our safety professionals or our supervisors, they're very busy and they've got all these legal things and they panic. If I look at our AdWords, just to put an example, everyone Googles safety compliance. And then no one Googles safety culture. It's like so low down on the hit. They're just so worried about the compliance. But how do we, as a leader, inspire people to actually remember the communication side? Yes, the legals are there, and that's what allows us to work. But how do we keep it real? So that's every day what we focus on, and really from an African lens. So all our content is inspired by Africa, and also about the real things that matter in our communities. You talk about transport. Some people jump in their Porsche or their double cab. Other people are walking or on a bike. So getting to and from work is a massive thing, and it's very different for a lot of the people in one organization. So how do we remember that, but without being patronizing, or for leadership feeling, oh, it's only for them and it's not for me? So just to really bridge that gap and make it everybody's conversation. So that's really what we focus on. And the creative and the visual comms really helps. It really helps to spark the conversation, because pictures are worth 1,000 words.
Yeah, so consider it at a heart level, consider it at a leadership level, consider it at a culture level. And we wouldn't be WiMSA without considering it from a gender level as well. So Tebogo, that comes to you. And the question that I want to ask is, what are the ways in which women experience safety differently to men? You have direct experience as a contractor and as a woman and as somebody who works directly with communities in the mining areas. Perhaps between you and Pietro, you can give us some insights on being a woman in the mining industry and safety from a gender perspective.
Okay. I think Pedro has touched on a lot of information that I wanted to share, but maybe I can just share my experience within, especially in the open cast mining as well as the underground mining. A lot of mining companies don't invest in making sure that women contractors are safe while we are working there. For example, you find that female toilets are sitting right next to male toilets and we are working in a field. How will I feel safe, using those toilets? Another example also, toilets underground, they are also next to male. I don't think they are investing in the emotional well-being of employees or emotional safety. One of the other examples currently happening within the gold sector or the platinum sector, you find that most of the CEOs will be paying themselves a lot of money while employees or contractors are not able to, because every time when we supply services to the mine as a small contractor, you don't really put enough money for like safety and other things. But when you go to large companies, you need to like comply with all the safety requirements. Currently, when you do the reporting, you not only report on the financial, you also report on environmental, social, and governance. And myself, I need to have an environmental policy, sexual harassment policy, and all those things. But then you go to the mine, you find that they don't really care about how employees are feeling if they're not paid well. That is causing a lot of strikes, and it can really turn away investors. So I believe mining companies should really take care of employees and contractors, especially women. I myself work in an industrial area where I believe a lot of women would be in the engineering space if there was like machinery and equipment that are easy to use for both genders. You find we are working on heights and some of the structures, they need to be replaced, but because the mine wants to invest in something else and not to repair all the structures in the mines, then it becomes difficult for me to recruit other women knowing that the environment is not really safe. So I always encourage, mining companies to invest in refurbishing all the structures. And even though there is no budget, they need to train more women to come and also invest in maybe automated machinery so that women can be able to work in this engineering sector within the mining. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Teboko. Petra, do you want to add anything else to that from a gender lens?
From a gender lens, I've been in this industry now for probably 25 years. Yeah. And I've seen a lot of changes. When I started working in the mining industry, it was just after women were even allowed to go underground. And a lot of my work has been underground. And initially, when I started working, there weren't change houses for women. You had to use the general manager's change house or that sort of thing. They had to find a special place for you to go and change into your overall. But that's changed. I can definitely see that we've made progress in that area. I'm lucky enough to work for a big mining company that cares about the fact that we want to keep our women safe. So it is, I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere, and it might be different if you're a contractor or if you're working for a smaller mining company. But I know definitely for me now, there's a place for me to change. I feel safe, it's got access control. And there's a huge amount of focus in keeping women safe in the mining industry at the moment. It's one of the broad themes of the Minerals Council's drive towards keeping women safe as well. So I think Tutula will speak a little bit later in this week around the general themes that have come out of the Women in Mining task team, which is what WiMSA is also a part of. And one of those is to keep our female employees safe and also prevent gender-based violence in the mining industry as well. So yeah, I've seen huge changes over the last 25 years, but I think there's still a lot more we can do. And we should never rest in terms of keeping our employees safe.
May I add something on gender-based violence in the community? If I can share an anecdote, just to reflect on one of the points I made earlier. A mining company in a Southern African country mining a precious mineral with an obligation to have state mine police as part of their security provision, dealing with ASM incursions. And the state mining police that were they had to rely upon them to be responsible for managing the concession boundaries. But what was happening is, of course, there was corruption, and they were taking bribes to allow the artisanal miners to go to the concession and access the material in, I should add, very unsafe fashions, which led to commonly collapses, especially risk of collapse is when the mining company would come and say, we're closing your pits. But what they were also doing was the men were paying financial bribes, but the women that wanted to go and sell water to the men, or who wanted to go and sell cakes or pies or whatever to feed the men, were being subject to sexual extortion in order to access the site. And this is an example, and in this case, I think it was difficult for the mining company to manage what the mine police were doing, because the government required it to be them that had this function. But there was probably more things the mining company could have been doing to work with the government and the police to tackle the issue of gender-based violence specifically. Unfortunately, in that case, the director of the mine held views that I could only call were racist against the local population, and made comments to me that were along the lines of, this is just cultural, we can't really influence this is not really our concern, which led to me writing a letter to the C-suite, and it led to a change in leadership at site level, which I was pleased to see. But I just want to make the point that this, again, it is, of course, first and foremost about your workers and protecting them. It is also about contractors who in some cases aren't given the same protections as workers, or that their greater vulnerabilities, perhaps because they are working as contractors, may not be adequately compensated for or mitigated around. But it is also about what provisions you put in place to secure your assets and your people, and how they could create greater vulnerabilities for others. And please remember the women in your communities in particular, and how they may be specifically vulnerable, so that we can avoid those violations occurring.
Estelle, thank you. I think you've really alluded to the fact that there are lots of different stakeholders that are affected by safety, that it's complicated, that it's complex, and that I don't think we're asking the right questions at the beginning, as Kate, you rightly said. And I'm very aware the president is about to speak and that everybody anxiously wants to go there. So I'm going to ask us to wrap up with a question from each of you that you would like investors to be asking, that would enable us to be looking at safety in a much more complex way. Okay, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, so mine is one that I often ask, and I think that I suppose it goes to your point about wanting to get to and believing that we can get to zero harm, but accepting that we're not there yet. And I always want to know, how are deviations dealt with? When I start asking questions and I'm doing a due diligence and I'm being told, no, everything's under control and we've had no incidents, and these are all our amazing policies, that is when red flags go up for me. And I really want to know, to me, it comes down to the culture of enforcement and taking action against things. We're not yet in an environment where everything is perfect, but we can get there. But I need to see how management is properly responding to the challenges as they come up. And today I'm going to leave with your words in my head about your people being an early warning system. I love that. And I'm going to steal that phrase if you don't mind. And it really is, what are you hearing from your employees, and how are you reacting and responding to it timelessly? That is what I'd love to see investors. Obviously, practically speaking, we're not going to have that question in a listing questionnaire, but it goes to culture and how are we investing our money in the correct places.
Thank you. Petra.
Yeah, so for me, the question is around culture. How are we creating a culture and building those leadership qualities that help us to get to a place where we eliminate fatalities, and then go even one step further? How do we eliminate serious incidents? How do we eliminate any accident from happening? So it's around what training and capacity building do you have in your organization to help people or leaders feel comfortable to have safety conversations? So what is that sort of program, on the job type training for people to be comfortable to listen to people, to build psychological safety, for anybody to be able to raise any question? So that's the sort of first thing, is what sort of training programs, and not just training in terms of classroom training, but on the job training do you have to build that sort of culture to eliminate fatalities? The second part is around, how do we create a situation where we constantly have this unease, where we don't have to have a fatality to react. Okay, because what happens is if we have a fatality, then everybody goes into overdrive and there's a whole bunch of directives that can come down. But how do we create that sense of urgency without having to have the fatality? So what sort of programs do we have in place to do that? And then sort of the third thing is, how do we get to a place where safety and the way in which we act safely is sort of built into our DNA? It is, we reach this sort of fluency, this leadership of practice place where it's just the right thing to do. It's whatever situation or whatever decision you take, it's around doing the right thing because we know in our DNA and in the way that we act, that that's the right way to act. So how do we build that sense of fluency in every way, or in all of the work that we do across the whole organization?
Thanks, Petra. Tebogo, what question would you like investors to ask?
For me, the question will be when investors or mining companies are busy making the safety policies and all the health and safety policies, who's sitting in the table? How many women are there sitting in the table, making sure that the policies are gender inclusive? And also when they go to mine at the communities, how many women are sitting in those meetings when they discuss the social and labor plans? Because you find most of the time they spend a lot of budget on other things that are not really related to women and empowerment and so forth. So I would like the investors to invite more women to sit in those tables so that we can help them to review the safety policies and also include some of the things that will make us safe to work in the environment. Thank you.
I like it.
Okay. So for me, the question I would love to be asked is, how quickly is innovation and creativity signed off in your workplace? Because what we find is often people are empowered to be creative, to bring in innovation, but actually procurement and signing something off can take months, years, really long. So I think if you're investing, you want to know how quickly change can actually happen. So that would be what I would like them to ask.
And Estelle?
Can I ask two?
Petra had three. So
Oh,
yes.
thanks, Petra. You laid the way for me. I think my first would be to ask about, to what extent do the people who may be impacted by you have equal opportunity to be safe? And I think really importantly, to Tobago's point, to feel safe. I think if you are questioning whether, if you're finding that people don't feel safe, then that's a wonderful way of seeing what you should be looking at. I think the second thing would be to say, how are you remedying incidents and how well are you remedying incidents? Because remedy costs a lot of money from first point of view from an investor. But on the other hand, from a human rights point of view, which is what I work on, you can really judge a quality of a company's commitment to its stakeholders through its commitment to remedy and how well it does remedy. And if it commits to remedy well, it means that it will be avoiding incidents because it knows it's going to have to do things well if they arise. So I see that as a proxy for overall good risk management.
I think these are great questions. And I think what I want to suggest to the audience is, imagine a world where we didn't have to rely on investors to ask these questions, but these were questions that we were all asking ourselves every day, all the time. I want to conclude by saying thank you very much to the panel. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much to the audience. And I think we've got about 5 minutes or so to take questions. So if anybody either here in the room or in Zoom has some questions for us, let's take those now. Some hands, how wonderful.
No question from me.
Rebecca, I saw your hand go up first.
Yeah, thanks, Bryony. Thanks, ladies. This was really great. I just wanted to touch on something that Tebogo mentioned, and maybe this is really just a question for everybody. We talk about safety training, which we do a lot of, and we talk about the Mining Health and Safety Act, look at Section 23, the right to withdraw from a dangerous workplace. So my experience, a woman's interpretation of a dangerous workplace on a mine or underground is completely different from a man's. So I would like to invite whoever has the ears of the committees who are contributing to the Mines Health and Safety Act to actually address those kind of issues from a gender perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. I think that's a really great point. There was another hand.
Thanks, and morning, everyone. Thanks to the presenters. Tutula Balfour from Minerals Council. I think I must start with the question that was asked. The people who sit on the Mine Health and Safety Council. I actually do sit on the Mine Health and Safety Council as an employer representative. So I actually believe that we do have a paucity of relevant questions at the moment. And maybe, you know, we should have a chat about that. Otherwise, I had raised my hand on two things. The one is, I think I didn't do my work when, as part of WiMSA, I didn't raise the fact that, you know, we're supposed to build this as mine health and safety, you know. So the health part, I think, was mentioned now and again, but most definitely we should always try to integrate that because both have an impact. The one visible plat right now, your head is off, and the other one, you might take 20 years, but you will in the end die from a health-related, you know, incident. The other was just to announce for anyone who is aware of the planned Rio Tinto, you know, briefing, the session that was supposed to be at about 11, that has been cancelled because one of the presenters is sick. Thank you.
Thanks, Tutula. I'm seeing an opportunity here to put together a group of people to ask really good questions.
Thanks, Bryony. My name is Sharon Pembe, and I'm part of the executive leadership team at WiMSA. And I just wanted to make a few points regarding the reputation of the mining industry. And drawing from yesterday's incident, where the mud wall collapsed on 4 miners at Harmony, and how the industry is seen, you know, in a bad light when these incidences happen. And, you know, it puts a lot of pressure in terms of us making a transformation in the policies, the safety policies in particular. And also my call is a question on investors to also take an audit in terms of the procurement of tools, safety ensuring tools in the mining space, so that all you know, occupants and employees are safely protected in those spaces, and for the leadership to call on the procurement of that, because as you mentioned, the rehabilitation or the mitigation measures are quite more expensive than the initial investment for those tools. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Sharon. Do we have any questions from our audience on Zoom? No. Okay, perfect. Any final question? Or I will release you to go and listen to our president.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've got value out of our discussion. There's still some food available if you would like to hang around and have some breakfast and network with us. We'll completely understand if you dash off. It was lovely to have you here, and enjoy the rest of Mining Indaba week.
Thank you.